Hey everybody! Today I'd like to address another question that I'm frequently asked, and that's what does your rig look like and how do you tie it up? So first, let me start with what my rig looks like, and later on in this video, I'll give you a step-by-step tutorial on what my knots look like. So my rig, it's pretty simple. I have a two-way swivel, I have a lead, and I have a hook. Well, it's all tangled up, but there's the hook. So my lead to start with is normally between 5 and 6 ounces. That's what I'm the most comfortable casting. Everybody's different. I would say, play around and see what weight of lead works best for you. My lead is connected to my swivel, and this line is about 10 inches long, I would say. I use the same pound test of line that's in my reel. So in this case, that was 40. So personally, one thing that I do a little different than others is I tie a little overhand knot about 2 inches away from my lead. And the reason I do this is I'm trying to make this the weakest point on my lead line. So if the lead were to get stuck, I'd be able to retrieve the rest of my gear. The reason that it's important is if there's a fish on the hook and the lead breaks right there, you'll be able to bring up everything else, and hopefully the fish is still on the other end of your line. So for the hook, I have about 2 to 3 feet of line, and this is 80-pound Andy, and my hook is a BKN 20. I normally use a BKN 20 to maybe 26 hook. I don't use extremely big hooks, and the reason is my philosophy that was taught to me by my father is that by using a smaller hook, you have the opportunity to catch more variety of fish. For example, if you're using a really big, 18-0 mustad hook, you're not going to be able to catch, let's say, a small o'io or veke or moi. It would have to be a really big fish to be able to bite that hook. But on the other hand, if you're using a smaller hook, let's say a BKN 20 or maybe a BKN 24 even, you'll be able to catch smaller fish. You'll be able to catch, diverse species of fish like kumu even, but you also have the opportunity to hook up bigger fish. All of my omilu, at least for sure, anything that was over 12 pounds was caught on a BKN 24 or smaller. My biggest omilu to date is 17 pounds, and that was actually caught on this BKN 20 right here. So really, you don't necessarily need to be using really big hooks to try and catch big fish. Personally, I would say it's better when you're starting out to use smaller hooks because you'll have the opportunity to catch more types of fish. And honestly, I think that keeps you engaged, that keeps you wanting to go back and catch something new. I really believe that using a smaller hook is something that everybody should try. I know it's definitely not the thing to do when you're slide baiting, whole taco or trying to slide, a nenue or something. A hook like this is not going to cut it. But for day-to-day, just shore casting, I prefer using smaller hooks. For the day-to-day fishing that I do, the rig that I just showed you is pretty much my standard. I don't necessarily change it based off of if it's shallow, deep, reefy, sandy. Because of the fact that I tie that knot in my lead line, even though I'm, let's say, casting in a reefy spot, I'm betting that that knot is going to break and hopefully let me bring up any fish that I catch. I know some people will adjust and make their lead longer and their hook shorter. The reason that I don't do that personally is because I like to have at least a 2-foot leader on my hook. And that's because if the fish, let's say, is a ulua or something that has scoots on its tail, I need that little extra barrier to keep it away from my main line that connects to my reel. And the reason I do that is because if I'm not cranking fast enough and there's a little slack in my main line, I don't want that ulua or any fish really to touch that main line and cut it. That's happened to me before. I was reeling what I thought was as fast as I could, but as I was reeling, I could see that with the wind, there was a slight loop in my line, and I looked out and I saw the ulua tail, and it did this really sad wave and it cut me off. So from that experience, I learned one, crank faster, don't leave any slack in your line, and two, make sure you have enough of a leader so that even though there might be a little bit of slack, it keeps the fish further away from your main line, and hopefully it'll prevent you from losing a fish like I did. But the other thing that people look at my line or look at my rig and say is, how come you do it this way? And honestly, it's just what I found works for me. I think everybody has a slight variation on how long they prefer their lead and leader to be. Even the 80-pound test on my hook, that's what I found works the best. I like 80 because it's actually a tight fit in the eye of my hook. The 80-pound test will go in and come out and it'll be nice and snug in there. It's not going to be so difficult where I'm not able to pull the line through. And it's also not so loose where it's going to be, moving around and loosening up your knots. In the videos that I'm going to show next, the tutorial regarding tying hooks and lead and tying everything together, it's going to be an interesting mixture of materials. I need to be able to show you exactly what I'm doing step by step. So instead of actually using my gear that I use on a frequent basis, I'm actually going to be using a 15-0 mustad hook, and my leader line is actually going to be a piece of yarn. So don't be freaked out when you see what I'm using. It's definitely not what most people, or I don't recommend using it to fish at all. It's just for demonstration purposes so you folks are able to see the knots and how I'm tying it. The same goes for my lead. I'm using a blue wire leader, and again, it's just so that you're able to see my knots. And really, I only use 2 different knots. I don't have a big repertoire of knots. I think any Boy Scout out there will be able to tie more knots than me. I only use 2, and it's always worked for me, so I have no complaints. But if any of you folks would like to learn the 2 knots that I use, feel free to keep watching and I'll show it to you in a few moments. First, let's start with tying our hook. I use a version of a snell knot. I'm not exactly sure what the correct name is, but this is how I tie it. I will grab my piece of line, starting from the front of the hook, the part where the barb is facing inwards. I'm going to put my line through the eye, and I'm going to grab this end right here, and I'm going to hold it against the shank of the hook. I'm going to then take this longer end and wrap that line around the shank of the hook about 5 or 6 times. Some people do more, but I wouldn't recommend doing any less than 5. And then I'm going to hold right here so I can get a better grip on the hook. Get the tail ends of my line, and we're going to come on back through the eye from the back side of the hook, the part facing away from the barb, away from the point. Go ahead and pull that through, and there you go. That is how I tie my hook. Next, we're going to move on to tying our lead. So I'm going to grab our lead and my line. We're going to go through the eye on the top and get this tag on this end about maybe 3 inches. I'm gonna hold right here, right on the top of the lead, and I'm gonna start wrapping that short end around the main longer piece of line. We're gonna do this 5 times. 4, and this is 5. This little tail end is now gonna be going back through this loop that we created on the bottom. So it's gonna look like this. And finally, we're gonna take this tag end and we're gonna put it through this big loop right here. We're gonna go ahead and pull that right on through. Then I'm gonna pull tight to cinch that knot down. And that is the improved clinch knot. I will personally tie an overhand knot and have that sit about an inch or 2 inches away from the lead. And that knot is designed to have the line break right there if this lead should get stuck in the rocks, or if a fish, gets your lead stuck somewhere. The hope is that we're gonna break right on this knot because that's gonna be the weak point in your line. Now that I have both of my hook and lead tied, let's go ahead and connect those pieces to the swivel. I'm going to use the same knot that I used to tie the lead. I'm going to go ahead and take the end of my lead line, put it through the eye of the swivel. Again, I'm going to hold right where the line and the swivel connects and wrap this shorter tail end around the longer line about 5 times. 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then we're going to take that shorter end. It's going to go back through the loop that we have right here by the swivel. Okay. By doing that, we should create another loop right here. We're going to take this tail end and it's going to come back through this loop. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this tail end and we're going to go ahead and cinch that knot down. I'm going to tug on it just to make sure that that knot is secure. And I'm going to go ahead and take my hook line and I'm going to tie it to the other side of the swivel. So there's 2-way swivel. This is going to go in the other eye. Okay, so same thing, thread through about 3 inches of line. I'm going to hold right here where the line and the swivel are connecting. Wrap around about 4 to 5 times. There we go, 4, 5. It's a little harder to see with the yarn, but we have a puka right here. We have a hole right here. We're going to bring the end through this loop and we're going to create the other loop right here. So pull this through. We're going to go ahead, pull that end through. Same thing. Go ahead and cinch that down slowly. Make sure that it stays nice and tight, making sure it's secure by pulling tight. And finally, we're going to go ahead and attach this setup to our main line, to the pole. So I'm going to tie that knot to the same side of the swivel where the lead is currently tied. So go ahead and thread it through. I'm going to go ahead and put 3 inches about approximately. Grab right where the swivel and the line is connecting. Wrap around 5 times. Again, you can go more or less up to your preference. Okay, take that tag end. I'm gonna go ahead through this loop right here, right by the swivel. Okay, we're creating this other loop right here. I'm gonna bring this tag end through this loop. Okay, pull tight. And of course, you can always clean up these tag ends by getting your pliers and cutting it down to size. Okay. And And there you go. That is what my setup would look like. I would have my main line and my lead connected to one side of the swivel, and my hook would be connected to the other side. I hope you folks learned a few things about how I tie my hooks and how I tie everything else. And I hope that you can take something away from this and maybe try it out in your next rigging session. And let me know if you guys do something similar, different, and what you think about my two knots. I know a lot of people have, way more knots that they use or a bigger selection of knots. Like I said, this is what works for me, but I'm definitely interested to see and hear from you folks regarding what you use. Thank you, and I hope to see you next week. I'll try and put these videos out weekly, and hopefully I can keep coming up with things that are important and relevant to you folks. Have a great week.